Well, it's really a great honor to be here, and I was just moved by the courage and the compassion of some of the speakers today. I didn't know why I came here and why I was asked to speak here, but I think I was asked to speak here just to hear what I've heard as I sat waiting to speak. For 30 years, I practiced medical oncology. I was primarily involved in patient care. I did a little research and a great deal of teaching, but my real focus was patient care. As I continued in my practice, it became clear to me that what I was really interested in was the character of the patient-provider relationship. And I think some of the people who spoke about their interactions with doctors made me cringe, because that's one of the things that I'm most concerned about, changing the parameters of that. So I spend a lot of my time trying to impart what I hope is the wisdom that I gained from my 30 years of practice, some major missteps I made, and I'll talk about some of those, and some wisdom and gifts that I was given as I went along in practice. And I want to share those with you because, in a sense, in your work, in your patient support groups, and your work in supporting each other, those same relationship tools are probably the most important thing. You can give all the information you have to someone, but if you haven't developed a relationship where they can hear you, where they can trust the information you give them, that information will just go in one ear and out the other. So I think information and knowledge is very important, but relationship creates the opening where it becomes possible for that information to be received. You know, I was giving this really big talk to a very major medical group, and I always start my talk with an anecdote, a story. And I was really upset about beginning this big formal talk to this medical group with a story, because doctors like data, they don't like stories. But then I found this article published in the New York Times by a member of the faculty of this group I was talking to, saying that stories are really better at capturing the big picture. They're really better for doctors to understand a point that's trying to be made about patient care. So I'm going to start with two very informative stories that really changed my perspective about the kind of doctor I wanted to be and what I wanted to do in helping doctors be better in the exam room. When I was first in practice, I came out of a very powerful medical training program at Harvard Medical School. And I went into community hospital practice, and I thought that I was the best that I could possibly be. And as it turned out, one of my first patients was a patient with metastatic breast cancer. And back then, 35 years ago, there was very few treatments for breast cancer. But in spite of the paucity of treatments, this woman managed to live 7 or 8 years, which was really unprecedented at the time, and it was really an extremely good outcome. A year after her death, I met her daughter in a local supermarket. And I was very excited to meet her daughter because I expected her daughter to come up to me and thank me for everything I had done for her mother. Instead, her daughter told me, "Dr. Mann, I want to tell you how awful the 7 years that you took care of my mother was. She suffered so much for all those years you took care of her. And now a year later, the family's still suffering." Well, that really changed me. It was like a lightning strike. I realized that I had done a lot of things to take care of this person, but I really didn't know very much about what was going on in her life. I knew everything about her bone scans. I knew everything about her blood tests, but I didn't know anything about her in a deeper way. I hadn't formed that kind of relationship. So the suffering that she had, I did not see. I might have seen the pain, but I didn't see the suffering, and her pain was very well controlled. That really changed me. I became a quite different doctor, and it took many, many years of thinking, working, and trying to do better. Until near the end of my practice, I took care of a woman with pancreatic cancer. Actually, she wasn't my patient, but I was covering for one of my colleagues, and I met her in the hospital over a weekend. and spent the weekend taking care of her. When I walked into her room was covered with pictures of this very beautiful woman with all of her hair, dressed up, full makeup on, with all the members of her family all over her hospital room. And what was in the bed was a woman who weighed around 75 pounds, had lost all her hair, and looked quite bad. But she was an amazing person, and I got closer and closer to her over the 2 days. And you know, sometimes you just form relationships with people. You can't even understand how you formed that relationship. But near the end of that weekend, for some reason, I was called to blurt out, you know, Mrs. So-and-so, you're really a beautiful woman. And you know what? She was, because I knew who she was after the weekend. I'd spent time understanding who she was. And the pictures in the room really reflected who she was in a deeper level than just the makeup and the hairdo and the clothing. Now, she ended up transferring her care to me, and she lived about 3 months. And there really wasn't much that, in a traditional way, I had done for her in terms of chemotherapy. But about 3 months after she died, her husband came to see me and brought this little handbook from her funeral that had a large paragraph about Dr. Mann and all the things he had done for this woman. And it was really a kind of a final understanding about the difference between two important concepts, treating and healing. You know, when you go to medical school, what you learn is how to treat. And that's what I learned when I started my practice. I was really good at that. That's how she lived for 7 years. But medical school frequently doesn't teach you healing. Treating is about dealing with the physical manifestations of disease, but healing's dealing with the bigger aspects of disease. And every illness, particularly as people have commented about prostate cancer, has other effects, social, psychological, and spiritual effects. And I realized as I grew in practice that I didn't know very much about spiritual effects, and that's actually what led me to become a hospital chaplain and study spirituality and how to deal with people's spiritual issues, because that was something that I felt I needed to know to be able to teach this and talk about it. Great doctors are good at both. Now, we all know the doctors who are great neurosurgeons, and they don't talk to the patient. They go in, they do the surgery, and the patient's cured, and the patients love them, and they're fine. But they're really great at treating, but they really have no notion of healing. And then, unfortunately, there's some doctors who are really good at healing, but not good at treating. They're great at making relationships, but they don't know what antibiotic to use for what medical illness. Ideally, you've got to be good at both. And the way you get good at healing is by developing empathy. And that's a skill that I think in your work, in your support groups, in your work, in your families, it's very important to develop and makes a huge difference. So I like to define empathy as a way of deeply understanding another person's feelings and point of view about themselves and the world they live in. That's the complicated definition. But the simple definition is to be able to see the world the way the other person does. Not to merge with them, not to become them, but in the moment of trying to create a relationship with them, be able to understand who people are. You know, there's some people who I would see in my exam room, and if they wanted me to talk to them about their illness, they wanted every detail because they're detailed people. I could usually see that by the way they dressed and the appointment they had. Ties, jackets, they were fully detailed. And then there were some people very casual who came into my office, and those people wanted the big picture. If I sat there and told them all the details, there was no connection there. They weren't listening because they just wanted to see the big picture. Everybody's different. So in creating empathic relationships, both as a physician and as a support group leader or participant, you have to understand that illness affects all those aspects of a person's life, the physical, psychological, the social, and the spiritual. And if you can visit all those and understand all those, you've developed a real deep empathic relationship with the patient. Now, I talked about that spiritual box, and there's a lot of misunderstanding about what spirituality is, and I want to just spend a little time clarifying that. Now, religion and spirituality are not the same. Actually, my view of things, I mean, Jason Mann has a lot of theories about the world. I love to theorize, but I think there's data to support it. Religion is really on the wane in our society. Religion is something that's a set of beliefs that's practiced in community. Community in our society, unfortunately, is disappearing. When they named this thing, they didn't call it the us phone. They called it the iPhone. That's not a coincidence. They understood the culture. They understood this is an I culture, not a we culture. It once was a we culture. It's not anymore. That's when religion was more powerful. Now we're in a situation where spirituality is a much more compelling argument for people. People still have the same needs, but they express them in different ways. When I worked as a chaplain, people would frequently tell me that they have no religion, but they were spiritual. And I'll talk a little bit about what that means. But spirituality is a way people find meaning in life. They're a way they define themselves in the world they live in. You know, I kind of feel like everybody has some level of spirituality. Everybody has something they believe in. You know, when I made a chaplain visit, I would go and see people and they say, chaplain, I don't believe in God. So I'd say, well, what do you believe in? And everybody has something they believe in, something that has meaning to them. Frequently it's their family or their love relationships or their kids, or sometimes it's things like science or mathematics or going in the woods. Everybody has some spiritual belief. And there's really a lot of data on spirituality in medicine and how it contributes to the care of people. There's a real high prevalence of spiritual beliefs in patients. It kind of changes depending on where you are and what region of the country you're in, changes with age. I think one of the board members was talking to me and said how his illness uncovered his need to make connection with his spiritual life. And frequently illness brings these things forth. There's a lot of ways of understanding the impact of spirituality on medicine. It improves empathy and trust. It improves quality of life, and it has beneficial biological and physical effects. But spirituality doesn't have only good effects. There are some negative effects. So let's walk through some of those. There's lots of studies, doctors like data, and there is data that show that if you look at surveys of patients, if spiritual discussions occur between them and their providers trying to understand who they are, how they understand the world, there's an improvement in trust, and that they listen to the advice their doctors give. There's other data that shows the same thing. There's also data that shows that people who have strong spiritual beliefs that are constructive have improved coping, reduced anxiety, decreased depression, an increased sense of hope. That's assuming that the religious experience gives them a sense of meaning and peace, and we'll show that some, not all do. There's data that shows that when doctors or medical systems deal with the spiritual issues of their patients, there's improvement in the quality of life. We'll talk a little bit more about hope and suffering, which it's really interesting. My last few slides are about hope and suffering, and I was very drawn to the fact that your vision statement contains those two words, because I think they're very important words in the medical system, and I think the medical system has ignored them, or in some sense been afraid of them. So we'll talk a little bit more about those, and I really honor you that you put that in your mission statement, because I think it's really important. There's more data on improvement of quality of life from a breast cancer study, from a hospice study, less depression and anxiety. There's also physiological effects. You can measure patients who have strong spiritual beliefs and spiritual paths and show that their blood pressure levels, their blood lipid levels, their immune function, and even their survival in various illnesses are improved if they have strong spiritual connections, spiritual beliefs that are comforting. There's actually some biological mediators. You can study some blood chemicals of patients who have strong spiritual beliefs and connections to their spiritual path and show that this biological mediator, IL-6, is decreased in patients with some connection to spiritual community. But as I said, not all spiritual beliefs or practices are beneficial. If you look just at religiousness, it didn't always correlate with positive outcomes. Religion is really interesting. What I really like about religion is it brings community together to do really good things. They go and they bring food and they bring meals to people who are sick. They distribute charity to people who are sick. They have food kitchens for the homeless. I live part-time in New York, and I see the wonderful food kitchens they offer to the huge homeless population in New York. That's great. But then when you get communities of religion together that corrupt the religion and use it to create violence in the world, like certain religious movements, it's not good. So religion can be kind of a mixed bag, and some religiousness doesn't really correlate with good medical health. Some people, when they get sick, they get angry at God. How did God do this to me? I've been a good person. I don't understand why I've gotten punished this way. Some people suffer because they feel like their illness is a sign that they're not a good person. Doctors are really troubled, and I've been troubled at times as a physician when patients and their family have strong beliefs that miracles will cure their illness. It's not unusual to have to see a family in an intensive care unit where someone is brain dead on a respirator and their family's praying for a miracle to bring them back to life when that's just not possible. So some spiritual beliefs can be really troubling. So I want to spend the next few slides talking about something very important. It's particularly important to you as support group leaders because you're going to come across this. And it's good to have some insight and some recognition about how to deal with it and how to be a source of healing in your support groups and with your friends and family. One of the things that occurs when people are sick is that their illness can create what's defined as spiritual distress. Spiritual distress means that they're just no longer in that comfortable zone they were before. You talked about that, and you found a new place of comfort. But some people don't find that easily. And there's a great deal of pain and discomfort that occurs with it. So by spiritual distress, I mean loss of meaning, losses of comfort and hope, and conflict between beliefs and life events. Let's look at each one of these. So I said in the beginning that when I went in to see people as a chaplain, very frequently people would say that they don't know why, they don't want to talk to me because they don't believe in God and they're not religious. And I was just there to talk to them and to support them and comfort them. I wasn't there to have a discussion about religion. I wasn't there for a theology lesson. I was there to create an empathic relationship where they could talk about in what way their illness was making them struggle. So in the interest of being able to do that, I really asked them what they believe in. And everybody had something that they believed in, an idea that made life worth living and gave it a sense of meaning. So how does illness cause loss of meaning? Well, in the Pacific Northwest, one of the big things people like to do is hike and go fly fishing. Now, I don't know whether anyone of you here have gone fly fishing, but when you go fly fishing, there are a lot of rocks on the bottom of the stream, and it's very slippery. And I've had lots of patients who are fly fishermen. But if a fly fisherman gets an amputation of his leg, that ability to go out into the river and fly fish and leave it all behind and feel connected to nature and feel like everything is right disappears. There's a loss of meaning. And I think somebody talked about the intimacy problems in prostate cancer. Intimacy is a big source of meaning in marriage. When you lose that source of meaning in your marriage, you're in spiritual distress. It's not just an emotional reaction. So I started the talk with my anecdote about the woman with prostate cancer, with pancreatic cancer. Well, her source of meaning was her sense of her own beauty. That might sound kind of narcissistic and not okay, but it was okay, because it was a way she expressed her inner beauty by taking care of her outer beauty as well. So I didn't see it in her as strictly narcissistic. So when I told her that she was a beautiful woman, that was extremely healing, because I restored that meaning that she had lost. She saw that she was still the same person, that even though she didn't look the same as the pictures, her fundamental being had not changed. So that's why that was such an important thing to say. Losses of some comfort and hope. So when people get sick, they frequently do just the wrong thing, either due to their sense of being broken or their sense of shame, or however you want to understand it. They withdraw from community. They go and they isolate themselves. Sometimes it's due to depression. And they lose exactly what they need, because we're really herd animals. Look at how many of us are here today, right? We're herding. Humans derive hope and comfort from being with other humans. Sometimes you can help people find these kind of relationships by encouraging support group membership, or encouraging them to reconnect with some other communities that they've withdrawn from, like their religious or spiritual communities. This is a big one for many people who have strong connections to their underlying religious beliefs, which is theodicy, which is why does bad things happen to good people? There's no understanding theodicy. I'm studying to be a rabbi. I'll never be able to fully explain that to people. My fallback is that however you want to understand God, it's much too complex for human understanding. So to understand God's work in the world, or unfolding of the world through some spiritual being, it's too complex for humans. But it causes a great deal of spiritual distress. So here are some of the ways that spiritual distress gets triggered. Car accidents, sudden any kind of traumatic event, bad and unexpected news about illness, life-threatening situations, isolation. Sometimes people get diagnosed with an illness at the same time there's a personal crisis going on in their lives that makes it much more difficult for them to cope with their illness. Like they're getting a divorce and they get diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. Anniversary issues, the illness occurs at the same time something else bad happened in their lives. And loss of body functions, we talked about that in terms of intimacy issues in prostate cancer. How can you tell if someone's in spiritual distress? Well, tears and weeping is one way. Withdrawal, complaining, anger at providers, sleep disturbances, all of those can be signs of spiritual distress and a call for help, even though the people don't really know how to define what's going on. If you see these kinds of things going on, there may be, in addition to an emotional component, a spiritual component. The thing about crying is, when we see people crying, the first thing we want to do is get them to stop crying, because we have this feeling that the crying is going to go on and on and on and never stops. People always stop crying. It doesn't even take that long for them to stop crying. It's good to let them cry it out. If you stop the crying, it really shows that you're not comfortable being with the crying. And people need to feel like you're there for them. So it feels like you're helping them, or healing them to get them to stop crying, but you're really not. You're just creating distance. So if someone's crying with you in a support group or anything, give them a tissue. Let them finish. Let them finish. It'll stop. Give them a tissue. There's lots of data on spiritual distress and medical outcomes. Just as I said that spirituality, positive spirituality gives good outcomes, spiritual distress leads to all these kinds of bad outcomes. So it really needs to be dealt with. Here are some of the ways you can deal with spiritual distress. This is what you do in your support groups. Listening and not fixing, letting people talk it out, tell you what's going on in their lives. That's such an important thing. When I transitioned from being a chaplain, from being a doctor to a chaplain, I was called in the middle of the night to go stand with a man whose brother had just died. Now, as a doctor, I would have gone up there and said, well, we tried everything, we did it. I would have had my whole narrative about what to say. But as a chaplain, there's no narrative. There's nothing, you don't explain the medical consequences of what happened. And all I did was just stand there with the person, with my hand on his shoulder. The next day, he wrote a letter to the spiritual care department, thanking them for all I had done for him. But what I did was just put my hand on the shoulder and listen to him while he talked to me about his brother. That was all. So listening is extremely helpful. Encouragement, if the patients have a relationship with clergy, support groups are great. And certainly if you see people in the setting of hospital, if there's chaplaincy services in the hospital, chaplains are really experts at dealing with spiritual distress. That's what their training centers around. So I said I was going to talk about pain and suffering, and it's good. The time is working out really well. Because one of the things that I think is my next real focus of some of what I want to speak about is this whole issue of how our medical care system deals with pain and suffering. You know, we went from a situation where pain control was very poor in the medical system because doctors were very afraid of patients getting addicted to narcotics, so doctors withheld narcotics, didn't give them the right way, and were very unsophisticated with the way they dealt with pain. And there was a big initiative to make pain control better in hospitals. And when patients come into a hospital, they're given a little scale with faces, how much pain do you have? Do you have a little? Do you have a lot? And every day they're given this scale to evaluate their pain. But they're never asked about their suffering. What hospitals really need to do is give a little scale to say, how much are you suffering right now? Because suffering is really much more difficult than pain. What did that family tell me? What did that daughter tell me in the supermarket, right? She told me how much her mother had suffered and told me her family was still suffering. It's because pain is only momentary. It doesn't last. Suffering can last long periods of time, and there's no medicine to take for it. So I think what we really need to do is focus on suffering as well as pain, to spend as much effort that we're spending on suffering as we're spending on pain. I think that's the next step. We've only taken a partial step. So how do you deal with suffering? It's much more complicated than dealing with pain. There's not sophisticated technology for it. But a start is to be able to sit with those who are suffering and listen to them and be with them in their suffering. I think that's one way to relieve suffering, through the power of human connection, through the love we have for each other. We might not really know how we express that, but I believe that we do express tremendous love for each other just in presence. I want to finish with this idea about hope. That's in your new vision statement too. I think it's a really important word too, and the medical system has a lot of trouble with it because they understand hope as the only thing that hope means. You don't want the patient to get unrealistic hopes. Well, that means that you don't want the patient to think that everything is curable, because unfortunately, everything isn't curable. That's just the reality of things. But that doesn't mean hope needs to disappear, because a lot of people define hope in different ways. It's not always an expectation that the illness will be cured. Sometimes it's about the relief of suffering, that they just want to be in a place where they can accept what's going on without crying, without feeling like their life has no value, because even in the final stages of life, there's value. There's value to be gained. Sometimes there's unfinished work to be done, and they want to have the hope that that can happen. So I think a much better way of understanding hope and a better way of supporting it is to know that, and this was a great quote I found, for some people, hope is not looking for a way out, but just looking for a way through their present situation. And I think we should never take that away from people. We should never make them feel like there's no way for them to get through whatever the crisis there is. So I think if I was to reconfigure medicine and to work with, and when I do work with medical students and medical residents, and as people who run support groups, I think the two issues that are critical, and it's so great that your vision statement contains those, is suffering must be dealt with and can be dealt with through presence. And hope should always be supported, never taken away. There is always hope. Thank you. So I'll be happy to answer any questions. How to treat suffering? I think one thing that helps to treat suffering is relationship. And unfortunately, doctors aren't really working hard enough on creating relationships. And also the relationships you have with your family also relieve suffering. So I think relationship is the way to deal with suffering. I think that's the best technology we have to deal with suffering. I think when people feel alone and feel separated from their physicians or from their family or from their community, they suffer. The pain takes on a different meaning.
There's an amazing thing that happens when people realize that that other people have walked this walk, felt the same feelings that they have, experienced the same suffering that they've experienced. Somehow realizing that life is not simple. Life is very difficult, and they're not the first one to feel these feelings, reconnects them
Right.
with the people around them. And if they can get out of this isolation, this sense of I'm alone, I can't share what's going on with me, to a point where I can talk about it with some people, some selected, chosen people who will listen to me and not try to fix it.
Right.
And that's when suffering begins to be, relieved.
Yeah. There's a lot of doctors feel a lot of time pressures, but they don't allot their time in a proper way. They spend their time, they don't allot their time or proportion their time with the patient in the proper way. So they end up wasting time rather than, because actually forming a good relationship with a patient saves time in the long run. And that's another conversation, but it does save time.
And the healing.
Right.
I mean, a lot of the stuff that we do about informing ourselves, holding institutions accountable, all that is part of the fixing, and it's crucial. But I think you pointed out the same importance, or even more, attaches to support, to the hope.
Right.
But I think we work both things at
Right.
the same time. Not at the same time. We have to know what the balance should be and when each gets implemented,
Right.
so you get the benefit of both
It's like
approaches.
the treating and healing dimension. The treating is providing that information they need, the concrete details they need. The healing is the other piece.
And I think our support groups actually Go with both.
That's great. Perfect.
As a prostate cancer advocate and survivor, what do I say to a wife whose husband is in stage 4 of prostate cancer, and she calls me and she wants me to say something to her that is positive? Clearly,
what?
that is positive. Clearly, he is in a very, very dismal and final state of this. And she calls me because she heard that we are part of a group in the Bahamas who are strong advocates for men, all men, to get screened, and for men who are going through the stages of prostate cancer. What do I say to her in terms of hope, and how can we mitigate the suffering for herself and her husband?
Well, that's a terrific question. And I guess, there are many kind of different situations where people are stage 4. I mean, there's some people are stage 4 and they're going to live for 15 years with stage 4 prostate cancer, and some people are stage 4 and they're going to die in 3 weeks. So it would depend to some degree on what the specific situation is. I think what I really tried to do in my relationship with patients when they were not curable, when they had a disease that wasn't curable, I really tried to let them know that what really needs to happen is that we really need to figure out how they're going to live in this situation for however long they're going to live. That it's not a matter of duration, it's a matter of what we're going to do with this time now and how we can optimize this time that you have. That, when people die, that's really not controlled by doctors. Any idiot doctor who says somebody's going to die in 6 months is just an idiot, because they never die exactly in 6 months, and if they do, it's just happenstance. So the issue is how they're going to live with this situation and what they're going to do, what they want to do with this time that they have to make it a valuable time. I think that's really where I would go.
Can
with
I
that.
comment on that question? Because it's such a tough question. Should I stand?
Yeah, please.
It's such a tough question. I mean, none of us, we don't want to talk about the end, and we don't know how to. And I mean, I've been through it. And on Helpline, there's certain things that are just above my pay grade, my emotional pay grade, my spiritual pay grade, everything else. And when I was going through this with my husband, and he was sick for a very long time, and there were a few times when honestly we thought he was going to pass and he didn't, because nobody knows, first of all. Nobody knows. But I realized that, if I was going to go to Chicago, because I live in Florida, I'd talk to somebody that lived in Chicago. And whatever you want to call it, there are books written by people who have, let's say, crossed over and come back. Whatever crossing over is, I don't know. Everybody can have their own idea or understanding of that. So I began to seek out some of these books, which gave me something to just read to my husband. So again, it's a really tough subject to talk about, but other people are talking about it. So it's really important to know who your people are. There's sometimes I'll just quote, if I'm talking about something that's above my pay grade, I'll quote Mayo Clinic, or I'll quote an expert, or I'll quote Paul Schellhammer. But that's one of those times when these books are out there, we just don't think of it. But for us, that was really helpful.
Oh, okay. Mm-hmm.
Another woman's, is this on? Okay, another woman's point of view on that question, because I lead a women's support group, and I'm also a spiritual director, which is not exactly a chaplain, but it's a person trained in listening to people and their spiritual needs and their spiritual journey. And oftentimes, if that question would arise, it's really not, again, a question, fix me. It's a question, listen to me. So I'd reverse that back. And like you said, everybody's different. So see what kind of intimacy that person is missing. And sometimes intimacy can be just reading together. I had a friend say that 10 minutes of skin time a day is the most intimate thing you can do. It doesn't have to be anything more than just press yourself skin to skin. It's reminding you that you're not alone And that's good enough in a lot of cases. So just my 2 cents.
Sure, there's lots of studies on empathic relationship, and the most powerful empathic tool is touch. That's why it can create such havoc or create such good. You know, you have to be really careful how you use touch, but it's very powerful.
I have a question about the issue of anger. I noticed that some men come into our groups and they're angry because this disease has caught them. When there's anger there, it seems to suspend all hope. It stops, it prolongs suffering. Anger is something that's very hard to deal with. Could you speak to that, please?
Anger is very hard to deal with, and again, I'll fall back on my spiritual direction training. It's something that people need to talk about. And I guess one of the things that I might say is, how is your anger serving you and how is your anger limiting you? Decide how you're using it. Can you use it as a force that's going to be helpful to you, or is it a force that's limiting you? And leave that question with the person. And then they can think about that, because anger is really a good thing. It can energize you, but it can also limit you, right? Some of what started this organization was anger and indignation that not enough was being done for prostate cancer. That's a good thing. But it was used to move something forward, not to create havoc. Okay.